the first myth is that people say, oh, the stock market crash of 1929 was the fault of unregulated capitalism. And then so this is a little bit odd because actually, if you read earlier in the American history textbook and you say, why was the Federal Reserve created? They'll say, oh, well, the Fed was created at the end of 1913 and opened its doors in 1914 because of, the single historical episode they'll usually point to is the Panic of 1907. And they'll say in 1907 there was no central bank, there was no Federal Reserve, and there was a crisis of liquidity, a major bank went down, and then J.P. Morgan had to come in and bail out everybody. And then, the nation's financiers and everybody realized we don't want to have our financial destiny in the hands of private bankers like J.P. Morgan. That's why we need a central bank like the European nations have. And so that's why we had the Federal Reserve established. And the whole point of creating a central bank was that, it'd be a lender of last resort and so on, and that it would allegedly, tame the wildcat free market. Okay, so on the face of it, it's a little bit odd that the worst financial crisis in U.S. history, at least to that point, some people say that, the one we're going through now is even worse, happened 16 years after the Federal Reserve was created. Now, actually, we don't have time to get into it tonight. I subscribe to what's called Austrian business cycle theory, which blames the boom-bust cycle on central banks. It says that the central bank pushes interest rates too low when it wants to cause euphoria or prosperity, and that gives a false signal to people. It makes it look like there's more savings than there really are, and so it causes an upswing. Interest rates are really low. Oh, money's cheap. Businesses start expanding, hiring people, and it does look good for a few years, but then it's not real. Just because the central bank pushes down interest rates, that doesn't really make us richer. That's the idea behind the Austrian business cycle theory, and so eventually it comes crashing down. So you can, just to sort of give you some anecdotal evidence in favor of that view, as you can see here, this, you probably can't read the axis, the years, but this starts at 1920 and then goes up through, I think, 1938. All right, so and this is a chart of the Dow Jones. So you can see this peak right here is it's in 1929. Okay, so my point is, when people say, why did the stock market crash in 1929, from the perspective where I'm coming from, the question is not, gee, what happened all of a sudden in 1929 to make the floor fall out and give way so that the market crashed? Rather, the question is, what in the world pushed the stock market up to such heights? Right? There was a huge bubble in the financial sector that was kicking in the beginning of the decade here, and then reached its peak in 1929. So to understand that question, again, I invoke what's called Austrian business cycle theory after the economists Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. Some of you may have heard those names. And again, they say that this was not natural, unregulated capitalism. This was, it's no coincidence that this happened after the Federal Reserve was founded, because the Fed injected money artificially in the financial sector and helped pump up this bubble. Okay, so let me move to the next, just to give you some evidence of that. In 1931, there was a committee. The Senate formed a committee to explore what happened. Why did the stock market crash so heavily in 1929? And this member of the Federal Reserve, A.C. Miller, says that the Fed's 1927 decision to purchase government securities and lower interest rates was one of the most costly errors committed by any banking system in the last 75 years. Okay, so again, with our time, I can't go in and justify this view too much, but I just want to give you some evidence of the fact that it wasn't like the economy was just chugging along normally, and then for some reason in 1929 it just fell apart. It's that, no, something odd was going on all through the 20s that pushed the stock market way up, and then it just came back down to where it should have been. And so my suggestion is that part of it was the Federal Reserve was this new thing that was created. That certainly wasn't the free market. That was a central bank put there by the government. And in 1927, they actually consciously lowered interest rates to try to help Great Britain. Okay, we can't tonight get into what was going on with Great Britain, but it's not in dispute that the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates in 1927. Of course, what is in dispute is did that have to do with why the stock market really started zooming from 1927 onward? Just to make it more relevant for us today, this is also my explanation for what happened in the housing market. So the question again is not, gee, what the heck happened in 2007 or 2008 that the financial sector just imploded? Why did that happen? No, the question for me is, what in the world blew up this bubble, right? So this chart right here is showing a house price index, and you can see, especially after 2000, it really, or especially like about 2003 or 4, it really starts zooming up. Okay, this is just for Nevada, just to make it the most exaggerated, because Nevada was one of the states where it was most pronounced. But even if you just looked at the U.S. average, it has the same form. Okay, so again, the question's not why did things collapse all of a sudden. The question is what blew them up to here, so then they fell down. And again, for those of you who remember this stuff, there was a dot-com boom and bust at the turn of the century, or the turn of the millennium even, from 1999 to 2000, the dot-com stock started crashing, and Alan Greenspan was the head of the Federal Reserve at the time, and what did he do? He brought interest rates way down to provide a soft landing. And so that, I would argue, was not from the free market. That was the Federal Reserve creating money and injecting it into the financial system, and that did postpone the pain for a few years, right? People were thought, oh man, we should have a really bad recession in the early 2000s because we just lost $1 trillion in wealth in the stock market when those dot-com stocks came tumbling down. The NASDAQ crashed. But it wasn't so bad. And because what happened is Alan Greenspan just replaced the internet bubble with a housing bubble. All right, so he didn't really fix the problem by just pumping in money. He just moved the problem from one sector to another, and everyone kept spending and living beyond their means for a few more years. And then finally that came crashing down, and now that's, of course, exactly what Ben Bernanke's doing, even more so. Ben Bernanke pushed interest rates down to basically zero and pumped in way more money than Greenspan ever did, and I would argue he didn't fix the problem. He just bought us a few more years, and then the economy's going to crash even harder once this thing comes to its conclusion. Okay, so I know it's a very pessimistic outlook, I know. Okay, but let's go back to